Hello there. My name is Brooks Lamp. I am the director of the writing program and assistant professor of English at George Fox University. This video is to introduce you to the updated timed writing assessment, how the assessment is structured, how it will be graded, and some strategies to get you started preparing for taking the assessment. So in this update, this is summer of 2019, the timed writing assessment now has two parts to it. So I'm going to briefly overview each part and make some comments on how you might approach them so that you have a strategic and deliberate idea of what you're trying to do as you when you open that quiz and take the timed writing assessment. In the first part, we have the reflection on writing. Let me just read the instructions for that part real quick. Write a few paragraphs in which you briefly summarize your education in writing and assess yourself as a writer today. How would you describe your strengths, weaknesses, and tendencies as a writer? What do you find easy or difficult? Which phases of the writing process are most important or challenging for you? What are some examples of the kind of writing you have done recently, whether academic, creative, or professional? And note that I say on the instructions that you should probably spend about 20 minutes of your 90-minute part. That's because this is more or less a diagnostic section to give me context about some of your tendencies and your history as a writer, what you are bringing to Fox if you were a transfer student, some of your history, your previous experiences with writing will help me. It provides some context for me and will help me understand what I'm reading when I'm evaluating your assessment and potentially working with you in a writing improvement plan. So that's helpful to me. I do not need to. You do not need to go through these questions sequentially and answer all of them completely. I would just select the questions that are most relevant for you. Tell me what you need to, what I need to know, or what I might be helpful for me to know about your background and your current or your present self-evaluation about yourself as a writer. But I would only spend about 20 minutes on it or less, and move on to the more substantive and critical part of the assessment for passing the writing milestone, and that's part 2, the interpretive essay. Read the short text below and write a 70 to 90 word essay, which is about 2.5 to 3 double-spaced pages worth, analyzing and interpreting it. What is the text trying to say, and what does it mean? Answer this question by analyzing the text in detail. Your essay should begin with a brief introduction and a thesis statement that gives your definite interpretation of the text's meaning and significance. The rest of the essay should support your thesis by analyzing several features of the text that are relevant to and develop your interpretation. Focus your analysis on the text itself, avoiding subjective responses such as telling stories about your experiences. Organize your essay into coherent paragraphs. Keep quotes from the text very brief. And at this point, I'll pause and note that the rest of the directions for part 2 are a series of guiding questions that will help you perform your analysis. I'll say more about those questions in a second. So I've recommended that you spend about 70 minutes on this part because it's pretty much the section that will determine whether you pass the assessment. So you should spend the majority of your time on it, and it will take quite a while. It should take you almost all of that time, I would predict, to be able to go through those processes of reading, analyzing, drafting, and revising the interpretive essay. Let me just make a comment about that main question in the first paragraph of the directions. What is the text trying to say, and what does it mean? So this is a question about purpose. The writer has some idea in mind of what he or she is trying to get the reader to do or to believe. So think about it that way. Based on what this text is saying, or what this author is trying to say, what is this text trying to get the reader to do or to think? And if you think about it that way, that might help to to get you started on answering that main question. You will need, as the second paragraph of that set of instructions notes, you will need to have a thesis statement. And that thesis statement should be a distinct interpretive claim about what this piece of writing is saying or trying to do. And you are invited and probably encouraged to state it very clearly as a thesis statement. So feel free to say something like, in this essay, I will argue or show that, and then you can give the author's name or the name of the text. You provide your interpretive statement of what you believe the text is trying to do. Then you need to spend the rest of that essay analyzing several features of the text that are relevant to your interpretation, that are relevant to and develop your interpretation. And this is where those guiding questions at the bottom come in. As I note there, not all of these questions will be relevant for your analysis. Probably, in fact, you'll just find a few of the questions that seem to be particularly helpful for this particular short text that you're analyzing. Under the heading Consider Themes, under those guiding questions, Consider Themes, that first one I find to be very helpful in most cases. What central conflict or conflicts are evident in this passage? What's the main contradiction or problem that the author is setting up in this passage? And he or she usually does that by discussing a certain idea or a certain set of terms and contrasting them against each other. So that question, what's the main conflict or problem that's being dealt with in the passage? That's usually a really good one to start with, or to at least look at and give some priority to. So just another piece of advice I would give is to not focus simply on what the writer is saying directly in the text, but how the writing is put together, the way that the writer is saying it. Sometimes in communication and rhetoric and writing and literature courses, we call this form and distinguish it from content. Yes, you're trying to pay attention to content and think about what the writer is saying, but you're also, and perhaps the more interesting and difficult part, is to look at the form of the writing. How is it put together? Why is it put together that way? I like to tell students, don't stick only with, or don't stick primarily with, the obvious characteristics of the text. Try to find things about it that aren't striking you as immediately obvious that they have a reason to be there. The last thing I'll say about the strategies for part 2 is you need to organize this essay like a college essay, with a thesis statement giving the main point you're making in the beginning, and then each paragraph has to be coherently designed around a single point or idea, and it has to relate to or develop or substantiate or provide evidence for the thesis. So you might have to be selective. Focus on just the 3 or so things that seemed to relate in some way to what you're talking about. And it doesn't have to be super obvious. You can argue for, you can explain and develop reasoning for why it actually does support your thesis. And actually that's very helpful and usually quite successful if you can do that. You know, the author uses, for instance, these metaphors. These metaphors don't seem to, at first, to relate to the main point that's being made, but actually they are, and then you explain how you think that might be happening. So that's good. I'm encouraging you to do that. And that's why I say in the directions, each paragraph, you need to organize this essay into coherent paragraphs. We call this in composition, or I like to call it, the top-down form of organization. Academic writing, most professional kinds of writing, are top-down fashion. That is, it begins with the main idea and then substantiates or develops that main idea below or after the beginning of the document. So in a college essay, the document, we often say it has to have a thesis statement at the top, and then what follows substantiates that thesis statement. And that organizational structure or hierarchy, the most important thing at the top, like a heading, and then the development underneath it, that actually follows hierarchically at different scales in the essay. So at the beginning, you have the main claim, and then you have developing paragraphs beneath it. And within each paragraph, if you think about a topic sentence, usually the beginning of a paragraph, very near the top, often the very first sentence, is what we call a topic sentence. It's almost like a very small thesis statement for that paragraph. And it should be very clear and explicit. This is what this paragraph is going to try to show. And then you develop and substantiate that point that you made at the beginning of the paragraph. So even on the paragraph level, it's a top-down structure. So think about that. Try to aim for that kind of organization. If you look at the bottom of the directions, you'll see that I make a couple comments, or I give you a very basic rubric for how I will assess your assessment. It's only a pass-fail system, so if you don't, you have to keep retaking this assessment until you pass it. But by listing off some of the most important features that I'll be looking at as I assess it, or evaluate it, it'll give you an idea of what I'm looking for. I think I'll stop here. I encourage you to definitely use the guiding questions to give you ideas to launch your Part 2 analysis. And I also encourage you to make some draft notes or bullet notes for yourself plan out your essay a little bit before you start drafting. You have 70 minutes or so if you've budgeted your time to do Part 2. So I would take 5 to 10 minutes to just read the short text provided twice, maybe 3 times, and jot down patterns that you're seeing and read those guiding questions and try to develop several points observations, patterns that you notice, and then from there you might start to see how your response can evolve. Also, spend a little bit of time crafting that thesis statement so that it looks really sharp and professional when I start reading your essay. That right away there's a really coherent, really intelligent thesis statement right at the top of the essay. I highly encourage you to have a second window open, a blank Google Doc or a second tab. Use a Google Doc or use a Microsoft Word document or Pages or what have you, something that's not in Foxtail when you're actually drafting and editing your essay. If you hit backspace or a certain keystroke, often you can lose what you've written. So don't actually construct your essay in Foxtail in the quiz page. I would write it on a Google Doc, which autosaves, or some other Word doc, and then just copy and paste the final product before your time expires into the Foxtail quiz. Okay, thank you for watching this tutorial video. If you have questions, you can email me, which my email is posted on the Foxtail site for the timed writing assessment. Blessings, good luck.